Okay, now, so we are live, James. Hello, everybody. Paul Walsh from the Weather Channel. I'm here with James Hall, who is the chief winemaker at Hall and Pat's, which is just a fabulous winery here in Sonoma, California. I have to say, James, driving up here, I almost crashed like 3 times just looking at the scenery and at the surprisingly greenish tint to the hills around here, which I wasn't really expecting to see. So, James, can you just give us a quick overview of Hall and Pat's? The
well, it's Pat's and Hall.
Pat's and Hall.
Yeah.
I
Well,
stand corrected.
have you heard of the band Hall & Oates?
I certainly have.
So we decided to put Pat's first.
Is that because of Hall & Oates?
Well, that was one thing.
I'll be darned.
Also, if you say it real fast on the phone, you might come up with a different interpretation that has something to do with hauling.
Oh.
But, well, it's a family business. So the Pat's family and the Hall family, we met in 1987. And Donald and I worked at the same winery, Flora Springs.
Mm-hmm.
I was the assistant winemaker, so I was the little cellar rat running around, topping and making the wine in the cellar, and Donald was in national sales.
But you didn't step on the grapes. So.
Well, only if they were bad. But we met, and as kids, really we were kids. I was 28 at the time. We thought about how we would do things different, and if we had our own company, what would it look like?
Right.
And we decided to start a little wine company, sort of a weekend project, kind of a postman taking a walk theory that we were already in the business and why not. So we put a little bit of pocket change, literally $5,000, and we started making Napa Valley Chardonnay. So 1988 was our first vintage, and the wine sold well. Donald had excellent connections across the country. And we got noticed, and we were able to repeat, and one thing led to another, and finally we were able to go full-time and pursue it as our only career.
Wow.
After 10 years.
Was that right here?
Well, that was in Rutherford, Napa.
Okay.
So we started as a Napa winery, but being a Chardonnay and Pinot Noir exclusive winery, Sonoma really was the answer. Sonoma Chardonnay is the largest grape planted in Sonoma, where Cabernet is #1 in Napa. And the cooler climate, being closer to the Pacific, is critical for the Burgundian varieties, which evolved in Northern Europe, so under much cooler climate and weather. So Sonoma has a lot going for it. The proximity to the Pacific, which rarely gets above 50 degrees, is critical to maintaining that cool airflow that allows the grapes to ripen evenly without these heat spikes.
Yep.
So that's why we ended up in Sonoma. Moved to Sonoma in 2007 and built a winery. So it's really been a dream come true, and the business is now grown. We have 20 employees, which is way more responsibility than I ever thought I would be capable of handling. But it's a beautiful little business, and I'm thrilled that it's a success.
Awesome. Well, it certainly is, and the weather is exactly as you described this morning, where it's 50-something. I mean, it feels cold out there.
It's gloomy.
It's San Francisco-like.
And it's unusual because May is one of those shoulder months where when the fog and the onshore flow comes in, it can feel like winter. But just as easily, it can be bluebird skies and 80 degrees.
Right.
And this May has been surprisingly cold. The weather never repeats itself is an old joke, but I've never seen a May this cold. Of course, we have lots of weather stations scattered all over our vineyards, and the data is suggesting that it's one of the coldest Mays we've had.
Interesting.
2011 was a notoriously cold vintage. Very dreary, very rainy. I mean, the last big winter that hit the Sierras, record snowfall. I mean, 500 inches of snow or something like that. And this May is as cold as 2011 in a couple of our vineyards. So I'm scratching my head wondering what kind of vintage we have, because we had a record early bud break. The winter was warm as could be, obviously one of the driest winters ever recorded.
Yep.
And here we have a gloomy May. So just when you think you got it all figured out, something else happens.
So can you give us a bit of perspective in terms of the drought? Because everybody around the world and around the country, the headlining news is that California is going to run out of water in a year, and the end is near. How has that impacted you?
Well, I've been listening to the headlines and talking to people that have had water issues, and it's a very serious problem, obviously. on a statewide level, even as far up as Oregon, it's a very serious problem. A lot of farmers that are used to getting water from water projects have been cut down to zero. But on the North Coast, in Sonoma and Mendocino, we don't get any water from government projects. And most of the vineyards either use reservoirs that are filled with runoff or well water. And so we had almost a normal rainfall. Santa Rosa recorded 24 inches, which is 79% of normal.
Mm-hmm.
Some of my vineyards on the far Sonoma coast had over 30 inches, which puts them, well within the normal range. And so the groundwater supplies appear to be okay. The wells are functioning and the reservoirs are full. So it's strange that in this crisis we're having across the state, there's some granularity to that, and many of the vineyards I work with are in excellent shape. Despite the fact it was an early harvest,
right.
We've had no frost to speak of, which is always a concern.
Yep.
Because obviously with radiation, nice cloud cover and a little rain helps keep the frost away.
Yeah.
And we've had none of that, so we dodged the frost bullet, and so far the rain that we've had appears sufficient. And it reminds me a lot of 2014. 2014 was a similar year for rainfall, a little more rain, but it came in these two very large tranches, and it was enough to fill the reservoirs and set the stage for really a spectacular year. 2014 was one of the best years that I've seen at the winery, and it was, of course, the beginning of a very serious drought in California. So
yeah.
I don't want to draw conclusions, but so far the drought has been really not that big of an issue for the North Coast wine growers.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And so now, as you're looking forward, of course, the balance of the year and even into next year, are you concerned about the El Nino that's forming?
Well, I've been watching that with bated breath. There was an El Nino brewing last year,
right,
and it kind of fizzled,
right,
and everyone was like, "Oh God, here's
yeah.
one more chance for rain snatched away." But this is looking a little more tenacious. My understanding is that some of the indicators out of the South Pacific around Australia are looking a little more favorable. And I saw an article that hit the paper. It was a long-term study about California's ability to handle high water. And everyone was laughing about it. And it was analyzing the impacts of a 100-year rainstorm.
Right.
And of course it landed flat with everyone talking about the drought. But it got me thinking that it wouldn't be entirely improbable that we finish this drought with a real wet winter. Things seem to be oscillating back and forth in the weather in general with more ferocity. And
yes.
So it wouldn't surprise me at all that this drought ends with a bang. In which case, who knows? Typically with an El Nino, obviously we get a lot of rain. But it tends to be warmer.
Yep.
And so snowpack doesn't necessarily follow, which is really the engine that drives most of the water in California is the snow. But from a grape growing point of view, it could be an early vintage or rain onset, I should say. And it's not unusual for it to rain in October in the harvest season. And that's towards the end of harvest. This year being 2 to 3 weeks early because of the very dry spring, we will most likely get our grapes in the barn before any fall rain. So I'm less worried about a potential wet fall, El Nino type fall,
right,
than I would if we had a more normal or even a late spring. So
right.
I feel like we're a couple of weeks ahead of a potentially, hopefully, very wet winter. I know everyone would love to see, 150% of normal, but just don't come all at once.
Exactly. This reminds me of 1997-98, which is the last time we had a really strong El Nino.
Yes.
And then it was too much of a good thing because that was where we had mudslides and flooding and all of those other kind of things. And you're right about the weather and Mother Nature. That there's always a balance that happens. I was surprised, frankly, that we had another dry year this year. It was almost a replication of last year, which is really, really unusual. So I think that the odds are really good that we're going to have a pretty wet year next year. But that would be really, if you look at the analogs, that would mean that the spring would be really wet. So this is next spring we're talking about. What would that mean for you?
Well, it will delay the growing season. So as the vines bud out, they're dormant in the winter, and the shoots begin to grow. There's a reciprocal growth in the root pattern in the soil.
Uh-huh.
And vines are a little finicky, despite the fact that they evolved next to rivers and creeks. They don't like wet roots. So ideally, there's some water that they can access, but most of the energy is taken from the soil that is not saturated. And so if it's a very wet spring, the vines can display a symptom called wet feet, where the roots are not able to penetrate the soil, and it gets a little bit of out of balance. Now, typically, of course, the soil dries, but it can leave the vines a little more susceptible to heat stress because the root system is not quite as deep in the soil and not quite as widespread. And of course, it'll delay things. So anytime, I mean, it takes a certain number of days to ripen a grape crop. And, when that falls in the year can have, pretty profound implications for the weather in the fall. Such as 2011 being a very cold winter, the vintage was delayed. And consequently, a lot of the late ripening varieties, such as Cabernet, particularly on the hillsides, got rain. And so it's inevitable the rain's going to come in the fall and probably shut the vintage down. The question is how many tons of grapes are still left. So if it's a very wet spring, it would suggest that there's going to be more exposure next fall to potentially wet harvest conditions. Fortunately, at Patson Hall, we work with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, which are some of the earliest ripening varieties in California, which in a cold, dreary vintage can be a real help, or an advantage, I should say. But in a vintage like this, where it's quite early and warm, it can be a slight disadvantage. So I'm actually liking this gloomy May that we're having because it puts my my ripening cycle back more to a normal year. But I'd love to see a nice wet winter, 15, 16, but I don't want to see anyone get hurt.
Right. There's always a limit.
Yes.
So it's, as sitting here listening to you, you sound like a meteorologist who's also a winemaker. But I guess that's sort of part of the job description.
Yeah. The weather is so important to any agricultural crop, but to my mind, wines and grape growing, a bottle of wine in a lot of ways is an archaeological record of the weather you've had. I've never bottled the same wine twice. Every year is different. And I'm always surprised at what an impact the growing season has on the character of the wine. That's one reason I think it's such a fascinating beverage. It's simply not a standard. Warm spring, cold spring, wet vintage. There's all these little variables that by themselves don't appear very significant, but at the end of the day add up to creating a much different texture and style of wine. And so it's fascinating to see how that plays out. And so I follow the weather very, very carefully, one, because I'm just very interested in it, but it's critical to my livelihood.
Yeah.
And I work with many family wineries. I buy grapes from 32 different vineyards, and they're all owned by small family farmers. And, of course, they're the man on the ground, and, they have literally bet the farm on these wine grapes. And so if I can help contribute some bit of knowledge about the weather and, what it looks like and help assure them that, we're going to get a fine crop, I like to do that. And, of course, it's essential. I've got a lot of planning to do, and I can't pick all my grapes in one day.
Right.
And so the bigger issue for me typically is what I would call a heat storm, where normally my vineyards in Sonoma have onshore flow off the ocean. So it's foggy in the morning, and then the sun comes out and burns the fog off, and you get this nice little run up into the mid 70s or low 80s, and then the fog comes back in the afternoon and repeat. But if the winds turn the opposite direction and we start to get the very low humidity, dry winds from the east, that can change things dramatically. The vines begin to dehydrate. Their evapotranspiration goes through the roof. We can't deliver enough water through the drip system to compensate for that, and they begin to dehydrate. And so the sugar accumulation